Beneath the crushing weight of a Svalbard glacier, where sunlight hasn't penetrated for decades, rests a secret that rewrites history. In 2023, what began as a routine geological survey transformed into one of the most significant historical discoveries of the century. A perfectly preserved German U-boat from World War II, entombed in ice for over 80 years. But it wasn't the submarine that left researchers stunned into silence. It was what they found inside. This is the story of U-731, a vessel officially recorded as lost in the Atlantic, its final mission classified beyond top secret, and the impossible artifacts that suggest some chapters of history were never meant to be opened. The Norwegian Sea has always commanded respect from those who brave its waters. With surface temperatures hovering just above freezing and depths that plunge to abyssal trenches, these waters have claimed countless ships throughout human history. During World War II, this frigid expanse became a theater of silent warfare, where German U-boats hunted Allied supply convoys like wolves stalking sheep. Many of these steel predators never returned to port, swallowed by the depths or crushed beneath sheets of ice. Local fishermen speak of ghost subs, submarine shapes that appear on sonar only to vanish when approached. Phantom echoes of lost vessels and crews. The Svalbard archipelago sits at the northern edge of this watery graveyard. Its glaciers, some over 1,000 feet thick, have been retreating due to climate change, revealing secrets long hidden in their icy grip. It was here, in the shadow of a glacier locals call Dødens Hånd, Death's Hand, that the first anomaly appeared. Dr. Thomas Murray had been conducting a standard geological survey for the Scandinavian Marine Research Institute, mapping changes in the glacier's underside when his equipment detected something impossible, a perfect cylindrical shape embedded within the ancient ice. At first, I assumed it was equipment failure, Murray would later explain in his initial report. The readings showed a metal object approximately 60 meters in length and 6 meters in diameter. Too regular, too manufactured to be natural. Follow-up scans confirmed his findings. Something man-made lay entombed within the glacier, preserved in a natural freezer for what appeared to be decades. The object's dimensions and composition matched only one possibility: a Type 70C U-boat, the backbone of Germany's submarine fleet during World War II. What made the discovery particularly unusual was the submarine's orientation. It wasn't crushed or broken, as would be expected had it been caught in a glacier's movement. Instead, it appeared to be perfectly preserved, as if the ice had formed around it while it remained stationary. When Sarah Jensen received the call about Murray's discovery, she was lecturing at the University of Oslo on lost naval vessels of the Second World War. At 42, Jensen had established herself as the leading authority on missing submarines, with particular expertise in the German Kriegsmarine. Her third book, Silent Service: The Untold Stories of Hitler's U-Boat Fleet, had just been shortlisted for the Wolfson History Prize. Jensen had dedicated her career to piecing together the stories of vessels that disappeared without distress calls, without debris fields, without survivors. Every submarine that doesn't return to port creates a hole in history, she often told her students. Each one is a sealed narrative, a story we may never complete. The Svalbard discovery represented something unprecedented in her field, a chance to unseal one of those narratives intact. Jensen's initial excitement turned to confusion as she reviewed the preliminary data. According to every historical record, no U-boat was reported missing in this specific region, she noted in her research journal. The Kriegsmarine kept meticulous records of patrol zones. No submarine should have been within 500 nautical miles of this location. More puzzling still, the submarine showed no external damage. No evidence of depth charges, no hull breaches, no signs of emergency surfacing or scuttling. It appeared to have been deliberately navigated into a narrow ice channel, almost as if seeking shelter within the glacier itself. "U-boats don't hide in glaciers," Jensen remarked to Murray during their first video conference. "This vessel was piloted here with purpose. The question is why?" The Norwegian government initially hesitated to approve a full excavation. The site fell within a protected nature reserve, and concerns about environmental impact delayed permits. For weeks, it took the intervention of Dr. Eliza Chen, a renowned maritime archaeologist whose work on preserving undersea heritage sites had earned international recognition, to finally move the project forward. "What we have here is not just a warship," Chen argued before the Norwegian Heritage Council. "It's a unique historical artifact that could provide unprecedented insights into naval warfare, technological development, and perhaps even solve the mystery of a lost crew. We have both the responsibility and the technical capability to recover this piece of history without environmental harm." By June 2023, a joint Norwegian-British expedition had assembled at a temporary research station 2 kilometers from the glacier's edge. The team included glaciologists, naval engineers, historians, marine archaeologists, and conservation specialists. Base camp was established on a rocky outcrop nicknamed Widow's Point by the local fishermen, who had long avoided the area. When pressed for reasons, the oldest among them mentioned only equipment malfunctions, compass deviations, and an old superstition about things that should remain frozen. The team dismissed these concerns as folklore, focusing instead on the logistical challenge ahead: how to create an access tunnel through 60 meters of dense glacial ice without damaging the submarine or triggering glacial shifts. The solution came in the form of specialized ice-boring equipment developed for Antarctic research stations, thermal drills that could create a meter-wide tunnel through the glacier with minimal vibration or structural impact. The plan called for a gradual approach, creating a sloped passage that would eventually intersect with the submarine's conning tower, which sonar had identified as the closest accessible point. Dr. Murray estimated the process would take approximately 3 weeks, assuming no complications. No one on the team anticipated just how naive that assumption would prove to be. The first concerning incident occurred 3 days into the excavation. As the thermal drill passed the 30-meter mark, the team's communications equipment began experiencing unexplained interference. Regular check-ins with base camp became increasingly difficult as radio transmissions were interrupted by bursts of static that seemed to follow a pattern rather than random atmospheric interference. Technician Peter Novak spent hours trying to identify the source, eventually concluding that the disturbance appeared to be emanating from the direction of the submarine itself. "It's as if something down there is broadcasting," he told Jensen. "But that's impossible. The vessel's batteries would have died decades ago." That night, Expedition Security Officer Mark Donovan reported seeing lights moving beneath the ice, like someone walking with a flashlight inside the glacier, he described in his log. 2 other team members confirmed the sighting. Equipment left near the boring site was found rearranged the following morning, despite no team members having accessed the area overnight. The security footage showed only snow and periodic glacial shimmer. Dr. Chen suggested that meltwater could be causing refraction effects within the ice, creating the illusion of movement. The team agreed this was the most logical explanation, but additional security measures were implemented nonetheless. By the end of the first week, temperatures around the excavation site had dropped unexpectedly, with readings showing a localized cold spot centered on the submarine's location. Glaciologist Hannah Reed noted that the temperature differential didn't match any known natural phenomenon. "It's as if something is actively cooling this specific section of ice," she observed. "The surrounding glacier maintains expected temperature. Gradients But this area is consistently 5-7 degrees colder than it should be. The boring equipment began experiencing mechanical failures, requiring constant maintenance and significantly slowing progress. Despite these setbacks, the team reached the submarine's conning tower after 13 days of continuous excavation. The moment of contact was recorded on multiple cameras as the thermal drill broke through the final layer of ice, revealing the dark metal of a hatch that had not felt human touch since World War II. The submarine's identification markings, still visible through a thin layer of frost, confirmed what the team had begun to suspect based on dimensions and design features. They had found U-731, a Type 7C submarine officially recorded as lost in the Atlantic in February 1944, thousands of miles from its current location. According to naval records, U-731 had departed from its base in occupied Norway on a standard patrol mission targeting Allied convoys. Its last radio contact came on February 3, 1944, confirming a position in the mid-Atlantic shipping lanes. After that, silence. Allied records showed no confirmed attacks on a submarine in that region, and no debris was ever recovered. U-731 simply vanished, one of dozens of German submarines that disappeared without explanation during the war. Until now, the process of opening the submarine's hatch was meticulous. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. With conservationists concerned about introducing modern air to a potentially sealed environment, special equipment monitored atmospheric changes as the hatch was slowly unsealed. What they found defied all expectations. The interior was perfectly preserved, showing no signs of flooding or damage. More disturbing still, there were no human remains aboard. Personal effects, photographs, letters, clothing remained in the crew quarters, as if the 46 men who operated the vessel had simply vanished. "It doesn't make sense," Jensen told the assembled team after their initial inspection. U-boats were cramped spaces. There was no room to store emergency vessels, and even if the crew abandoned ship, where would they go? We're hundreds of miles from any 1940s outpost in a region covered by ice and surrounded by freezing water. Without proper survival gear, they wouldn't have lasted 24 hours. Dr. Chen led the documentation effort, cataloging the submarine's remarkable state of preservation. "The ice had created an almost perfect vacuum seal," she explained. "Documents in the captain's quarters remain readable, with ink barely faded. Food in the galley hasn't rotted, just desiccated. Most importantly, the submarine's logbook was intact, preserved in the captain's safe. The final entries revealed a story completely at odds with official history. The submarine's last recorded position was indeed in the Atlantic, but the subsequent entries detailed an unexpected change of course. On February 4, 1944, U-731 received encrypted orders directly from Berlin, instructing its captain, Korvettenkapitän Werner Hart, to proceed immediately to coordinates in the Norwegian Sea. The nature of these orders was classified beyond the normal security protocols, with Hart writing that only he and his executive officer were privy to the mission's true purpose. The logbook entries grew increasingly strange as the submarine approached its destination. Hart noted compass malfunctions, unusual ice formations, and unexplained sonar contacts that seemed to track the vessel. His writing, initially crisp and professional, became more agitated. The final entry, dated February 17, 1944, simply read, "We found it. God help us all." After that, nothing. No explanation of what they found. No account of the crew's fate. No indication of what prompted them to apparently abandon a functional submarine in one of Earth's most inhospitable regions. The vessel's instruments showed no mechanical failures. Fuel tanks were still half full. Emergency systems had never been activated. There was food for weeks, fresh water, functioning heaters. Whatever had caused the crew to leave, it wasn't a technical emergency or resource shortage. Something scared them out of this submarine, Jensen concluded after studying the captain's personal journal found hidden beneath his mattress. Hart's private writings mentioned dreams, the same dream experienced by multiple crew members. A voice from beneath the ice calling them. He dismissed it as nerves or carbon monoxide at first, but the entries become increasingly concerned as more men reported hearing it even while awake. The mystery deepened when Jensen discovered classified Allied intelligence reports, recently declassified, suggesting that U-731 had been part of a special division within the Kriegsmarine. This unit, known as Sonderkommando Meereskunde, Special Command Sea Studies, was officially tasked with oceanographic research to improve submarine operations. Unofficially, according to intelligence assessments, it conducted missions searching for artifacts of historical or mythological significance. Hitler's fascination with the occult is well documented, Jensen explained during a team briefing. The Nazi leadership devoted significant resources to acquiring objects they believed held mystical power. The Spear of Destiny, the Holy Grail, Tibetan artifacts. Most historians dismissed these submarine expeditions as fantasy, but we now have physical evidence that U-731 was diverted from standard operations for a special mission to this specific location. The question is, what were they looking for, and did they find it? The answer began to emerge when the team accessed the submarine's cargo hold. Behind a false wall, hastily constructed based on the weld patterns, they discovered a sealed containment chamber that showed signs of having been built on board rather than at a shipyard. Breaking the seal, they found a collection of wooden fragments, carefully wrapped in oilcloth and secured in metal containers. Carbon dating would later confirm these pieces, dated to approximately 900 CE, consistent with Viking exploration of the region. Among these wooden fragments was a stone tablet covered in runic inscriptions. Marine archaeologist Peter Walsh, who specialized in Norse artifacts, provided a preliminary translation that sent a chill through the expedition team. The ice does not forget. The ice does not forgive. What sleeps below must remain below. We sailed too far, saw what no eyes should see. We seal this place with blood and stone. Let no man disturb the depths again. Further excavation of the cargo hold revealed journals and field notes, presumably written by the submarine's officers, documenting their discovery of what they believed to be a preserved Viking settlement within a glacial cavern. A settlement that, according to their notes, should not have existed so far north and showed signs of having been deliberately sealed. The final pages contained frantic sketches of structures described as non-Euclidean and architecturally impossible, with proportions that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. They found something down there, Jensen concluded, something that terrified them enough to abandon their submarine and venture out into conditions that meant certain death. But the question remains, where did they go? The expedition was about to face its own set of inexplicable challenges. Within days of opening the containment chamber, equipment failures became more frequent and severe. Batteries drained at impossible rates, digital storage devices corrupted for no apparent reason. 3 team members reported identical symptoms: nosebleeds, insomnia, and recurring nightmares of shadows moving beneath the ice. Most concerning, satellite imagery revealed the glacier was refreezing at an accelerated rate, threatening to, once again, entomb the submarine, despite it being the middle of summer. Norwegian military officials, who had initially supported the research with logistical assistance, suddenly revoked the expedition's permits, citing vague environmental concerns and national security implications. When Jensen pressed for specific reasons, she was informed that the site had been redesignated as a restricted zone under the authority of a government division she had never heard of, the Department of Historical Anomalies Containment. This isn't about environmental protection, Jensen argued in an emergency conference call with research directors. Something about our discovery has triggered protocols I wasn't aware existed. They're shutting us down because of what we found, or what they're afraid we'll find next. The team was given 72 hours to evacuate the site, leaving them scrambling to document and recover as much as possible before being forced to withdraw. Priority was given to the Viking artifacts, the submarines, logbook and Captain Hart's personal journal. Most frustrating to Jensen was the inability to complete their exploration of a sonar-detected anomaly beneath the submarine, a massive chamber deep within the ice that, according to geological surveys, should not exist. On their final night, at the site, with most equipment already packed and ready for transport, Jensen and Dr. Chen violated evacuation orders and returned to the ice tunnel for one last attempt to document the chamber. What their remote camera captured, in its brief journey before signal loss, would become the expedition's most controversial and classified finding. Glimpses of enormous stone structures, clearly artificial, embedded within the deepest layers of ancient ice. Structures that, according to all archaeological understanding, could not possibly exist in this location or at this depth. Before they could send a second camera, military personnel arrived to escort them from the site. Within 24 hours, satellite monitoring showed the glacier had completely resealed around the tunnel entrance, with ice formation rates that defied natural explanation. The site of U-731 was once again hidden beneath hundreds of feet of ice, along with whatever secrets remained undiscovered in its hull and in the mysterious chamber below. In the months following the expedition, its members faced unusual challenges. Research funding was withdrawn. Academic publications rejected their papers without explanation. Data storage devices continued to fail at unusual rates. Most concerning, 3 key team members, including Dr. Murray, who had made the initial discovery, abruptly changed their positions, now claiming the submarine had shown signs of extreme damage and contained no unusual artifacts. When Jensen confronted Murray about this contradiction, he would only say, "Some things are better left frozen, Sarah. Trust me on this." Military records concerning U-731 were reclassified. The Norwegian government denied any knowledge of a Department of Historical Anomalies containment. Satellite imagery of the glacier from the expedition period was declared to have been corrupted and unretrievable. It was as if something was systematically erasing the evidence of what they had found. Yet fragments remained. Physical artifacts, smuggled out in personal luggage, private journals documenting the discoveries, backup data stored on isolated systems. Jensen and a small group of trusted colleagues continued their research in secret, attempting to piece together the true story of U-731 and the ancient structures beneath the ice. What they gradually uncovered was a pattern extending far beyond one lost submarine. Similar incidents throughout history, ships discovering anomalous structures in remote regions, followed by crew disappearances and subsequent information suppression. Norse sagas describing an underworld entrance in the northern seas that had been sealed by the gods. Indigenous Sami legends warning of hollow places where the old ones sleep beneath the white blanket. Most disturbing was what thermal imaging had revealed in their final unauthorized scan, what appeared to be heat signatures moving within the chamber beneath the ice. Faint but unmistakable patterns of movement that suggested the chamber wasn't simply an archaeological site, it was active. The mystery of U-731 remains largely unsolved. What secret mission brought a German submarine to this remote location in 1944? What did its crew discover that made them abandon their vessel in conditions that meant certain death? What were the ancient Viking artifacts warning about, and why had they been sealed away with such dire inscriptions? Most importantly, what still waits beneath the ice, hidden once more from human eyes, but perhaps not dormant? The Norwegian Sea holds its secrets tightly. The glacier known as Death's Hand has once again closed over its mysteries. But as global temperatures rise and ice continues to retreat across the Arctic, one must wonder how many more forgotten things might soon be revealed. And are some secrets better left in their frozen tombs? If this story fascinated you, make sure to hit the subscribe button and notification bell to join us for our upcoming video, where we analyze the recovered runic tablet and its connections to other historical artifacts warning of things beneath the ice. Leave your theories in the comments below. What do you think happened to the crew of U-731? And what might they have discovered in those frozen depths? Some secrets are buried for a reason, but together, we might just uncover the truth about what lies beneath the ice that continues to guard its ancient mysteries. The frozen wasteland of Svalbard greeted the expanded research team with bitter winds that cut through Arctic-grade parkas like they were made of paper. Sarah Jensen stood at the edge of the new base camp, her breath crystallizing before her as she stared at the gleaming white expanse of the glacier locals called Dødens Despite the government restrictions and the official conclusion of the initial expedition, she had managed to secure private funding through Cambridge University's Department of Historical Anomalies, a small, obscure division that specialized in archaeological finds that defied conventional explanation. Dr. Chen had joined her along with a new team of specialists who had been carefully vetted not only for their expertise, but for their discretion and open-mindedness. They've reinforced the perimeter, noted Dr. Marcus Hoffman, a glaciologist who had previously worked on classified research in Antarctica. He pointed to barely visible monitoring equipment positioned along the ridge overlooking the glacier. Norwegian military, most likely. They're keeping tabs on this site even if they want everyone to believe they've abandoned interest in it. Jensen nodded, unsurprised. In the 3 months since their forced evacuation, she had compiled evidence of ongoing surveillance of both the site and the original research team members. Her university office had been broken into, though nothing obvious had been taken. Her digital communications showed signs of monitoring. 2 potential publishers had withdrawn interest in her preliminary paper on U-731 after receiving visits from individuals claiming to represent the Norwegian Cultural Heritage Protection Agency, an organization that, as far as she could determine, didn't actually exist. "They're watching because they know what we know," she replied, lowering her voice despite the howling wind that would have carried away her words anyway. "Something down there is still active." The team had established their new research base, 5 kilometers from the original site, ostensibly as a glaciological monitoring station studying climate impacts, a cover story that provided legitimate reason to have equipment in the area without drawing unwanted attention. Their true base of operations, however, was beneath the surface, a series of prefabricated modules buried 20 feet under the snow and ice, connected by narrow tunnels with only a small communications array visible above ground. The facility was designed to be virtually invisible to satellite surveillance, with thermal signatures masked by specialized insulation. Inside this hidden complex, Dr. Eliza Chen had created what the team referred to as the archive, a sealed room containing every piece of physical evidence they had managed to smuggle out during the evacuation, along with all digital data stored on isolated systems that had never connected to external networks. The centerpiece of this collection was the runic tablet, carefully preserved in a climate-controlled case. Around the walls hung enhanced images of the structures glimpsed beneath the ice, alongside maps tracking unusual phenomena reported in the region over the past century. The dating results came back yesterday, Chen announced, as she led Jensen through the narrow corridor into the archive. The wooden fragments are definitively from a Norse vessel, circa 870-910 CE. But here's where it gets interesting. She pulled up a detailed analysis on a standalone computer. The wood shows signs of exposure to extreme heat, not consistent with fire, but something more intense and focused. And there are trace elements embedded in the grain that don't match any known natural composition. Jensen examined the magnified images of the wood's cellular structure, noting the unusual crystalline formations within. Similar to what we found on the submarine's hull, she observed, the same pattern of molecular displacement. Chen nodded grimly. Whatever affected this wood 1,000 years ago left the same signature as what affected U-731 in 1944. We're looking at the same phenomenon separated by a millennium. The implications were staggering. Whatever had caused a Viking ship to venture into these frozen waters, whatever they had discovered and subsequently warned about in their runic message, had apparently been encountered again by the German submarine crew. A threat or discovery that had remained hidden, unchanged, for over 1,000 years. There's more, Chen continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper despite the privacy of their facility. Walsh finished his complete translation of the tablet. The standard academic translation protocols were insufficient. Many of the runes are from an obscure dialect only documented in a few sites in northern Norway. But he managed to piece it together. She handed Jensen a sealed envelope. He insisted on delivering this in hard copy only, said he couldn't bring himself to put it into a digital system. Jensen raised an eyebrow but took the envelope, breaking the seal and unfolding the handwritten pages within. As she read, her expression shifted from curiosity to concern, and finally to something approaching dread. The full text of the tablet was not simply a warning, as they had initially thought. It was a confession. According to Walsh's translation, the tablet had been created by survivors of an expedition led by a Norse explorer named Gunnar Eriksson in approximately 900 CE. Gunnar had led 3 ships north, following what the text described as lights beneath the ice that had appeared to several fishing vessels. The runes described how they discovered an opening where the glacier met the sea, a cave system that shouldn't have existed, showing signs of artificial construction despite the impossible location. The expedition had ventured into these caves, discovering a vast chamber deep within the ice where they found dwellings not built by human hands and artifacts of metal that burns cold and stone that speaks without sound. Most disturbing was the account of what happened when they attempted to remove some of these artifacts. Crew members began experiencing identical dreams, hearing voices that called them deeper into the white, and suffering physical symptoms, including nosebleeds and a progressive loss of orientation in time. The writer of the tablet, identified as Gunnar's second-in-command, described how half the expedition disappeared during a single night, simply walking out into the glacier without supplies or protective clothing, as if called by something they alone could hear. The survivors had sealed the entrance with a combination of physical barriers and what the text called blood-bound runes of warding, before retreating south to warn others never to venture into the region. The final passages contained a direct warning. What sleeps below does not slumber as men understand it. It waits, it calls, it remembers. The ice is not its prison, but its protector. The cold does not harm it. The cold preserves it until it is ready to emerge. If you read these words, turn back. Let the white depths keep their secrets, lest what happened to us happen to all lands of men. Jensen set the translation down, her hand trembling slightly. This matches Hart's journal, she said after a moment. The missing crew. He wrote about men walking out into the ice during the night, following voices others couldn't hear. History, repeating itself, or continuing itself, Chen suggested. What if whatever affected the Norse expedition never stopped? What if it's been there all along, occasionally encountering humans unlucky enough to venture too close? Before Jensen could respond, the facility's communication system crackled to life. It was Dr. Hoffman, his voice tight with a combination of excitement and apprehension. Jensen, Chen, you need to come to the monitoring station. Now, something's happening at the glacier. They made their way quickly through the narrow corridors to the facility's small surface structure, where Hoffman and 2 technicians were gathered around a bank of sensors. Through the reinforced window, they could see the vast white expanse of Durden's Hond, seemingly unchanged, but the sensor readings told a different story. We started picking this up about 20 minutes ago, Hoffman explained, pointing to a seismograph that showed regular, rhythmic disturbances. At first, I thought it might be normal glacial movement, but the pattern is too regular, and then we got this. He switched to a thermal imaging display that showed what appeared to be a heat signature deep within the glacier, directly over the location where U-731 lay entombed. The signature was pulsing in perfect synchronicity with the seismic readings. That's not possible, Chen murmured, leaning closer to the display. The submarine's power systems would have died decades ago, and even if there were some residual energy source, it wouldn't produce this kind of pattern. It's not coming from the submarine, Jensen realized, her mind racing as she connected. The new data with what they had learned. It's coming from below it, from the chamber. As if in response to her words, the seismic activity suddenly intensified. The thermal signature expanded, creating a spiderweb of heat lines radiating outward. From the central point, on the surface, visible through the monitoring station's window, a section of the glacier's surface began to shift almost imperceptibly, ice crystals catching the dim Arctic light as they realigned. We need to get out there, Jensen decided, already reaching for her extreme weather gear hanging by the door. Whatever's happening, we need to document it firsthand. Chen looked alarmed. The Norwegian authorities won't be able to respond for at least 6 hours in these weather conditions, Jensen completed the thought. This may be our only chance to see what's actually happening without interference. 20 minutes later, a team of 4, Jensen, Chen, Hoffman, and security specialist Maria Lavik, were making their way across the ice field on specialized Arctic transportation vehicles. The small, enclosed rovers could navigate the treacherous surface while protecting occupants from the lethal cold, which had dropped to -58 degrees as the sun dipped toward the horizon. They traveled in radio silence, using a prearranged route designed to avoid the Norwegian monitoring equipment. As they approached within a kilometer of the site, they could see it, a perfect circle of ice, approximately 30 meters in diameter, that appeared to be shifting, not melting, not cracking, but reorganizing itself, crystals realigning in patterns that ice simply should not form naturally. The effect was similar to watching sand particles arrange themselves on a vibrating plate, a deliberate ordering of chaos into symmetry. My God, Hoffman whispered, as they brought the rovers to a halt at what he judged to be a safe distance. I've studied glaciers for 20 years. This isn't possible. Jensen activated the rover's external sensor package, recording everything, from thermal readings to electromagnetic field measurements. The pattern, she noted, pointing to the geometric shapes emerging in the ice. It matches the symbols found inside U-731's containment chamber. The reorganization of the ice was accelerating, the circle expanding outward, Within it, the surface was becoming almost glass-like in its transparency, revealing deeper layers below. Through specialized binoculars, Jensen could make out a dark shape approximately 60 meters down. The conning tower of U-731, still entombed, but now visible through the inexplicably altered ice. It's as if something is creating a window, Chen observed, her scientific mind struggling to process what her eyes were witnessing. Or a doorway. A sudden spike in the electromagnetic readings drew their attention. The equipment was registering levels that should have fried every electronic device within range, yet their sensors continued to function normally. At the center of the circle, the ice began to emit a faint blue luminescence that gradually intensified, pulsing in rhythm with the electromagnetic fluctuations. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The ice ceased its reorganization. The electromagnetic readings dropped to background levels. The blue light faded, leaving only the dim glow of the Arctic twilight reflecting off the altered surface. But what remained was undeniable, a perfect circle of transparent ice, through which U-731 was clearly visible, like an artifact displayed in a museum case. "We need to get closer," Jensen decided, already preparing to exit the rover. Lavik put a restraining hand on her arm. "That ice has just undergone molecular changes we can't begin to understand. We have no idea if it's structurally stable or if it could collapse under our weight." "Send the drone then," Hoffman suggested, already unpacking the specialized aerial unit they had brought for reconnaissance. "We can get detailed imagery without risking personnel." The drone, a modified military-grade unit designed for Arctic conditions, was soon hovering over the transformed section of glacier. Its high-resolution cameras captured detailed images of both the surface patterns and what lay beneath, transmitting data back to the rover's systems in real time. What they saw left them speechless. The ice hadn't simply become transparent. It had reorganized itself into a complex three-dimensional structure of interlocking geometric patterns, forming what appeared to be a massive lens or focusing device. And it was centered not on the submarine itself, but on a specific point approximately 20 meters beneath it, the entrance to the chamber they had detected during the original expedition. "It's a marker," Jensen realized. "Whatever is down, there is making sure the chamber can be found. Or making sure something can find its way out," Chen countered quietly. As the drone continued its survey, its sensors detected movement on the surface of the ice nearly half a kilometer from their position. Human figures, at least 6 of them, dressed in white cold-weather gear that nearly camouflaged them against the landscape. They were approaching the transformed area with deliberate purpose, carrying equipment that included what appeared to be scientific instruments and, more concerning, weapons. Norwegian military, Lavik identified her background. Insecurity immediately evident. Special forces based on their movement patterns. We need to withdraw immediately. Jensen hesitated, torn between the need for safety and the opportunity to learn more about what was happening. "Can we maintain drone surveillance from a greater distance?" Hoffman nodded. "The drone has a 10-kilometer range. If we retreat to the secondary monitoring post, we should be able to continue observation without being detected." The decision made, they carefully backtracked, using a different route to avoid leaving an obvious trail. From the secondary post, a small automated weather station established 2 weeks earlier as part of their cover operation, they continued to monitor the drone feed as the Norwegian team secured the perimeter around the transformed ice. What happened next confirmed Jensen's suspicions that this was no ordinary military operation. The Norwegian team established a perimeter of devices that, based on their configuration, appeared designed to measure and potentially counteract the electromagnetic anomalies. Their leader, A tall figure who moved with the confidence of someone who had done this before, directed the placement with precise gestures before consulting what looked like an ancient, leather-bound book, not standard military protocol by any definition. "They know exactly what they're dealing with," Jensen murmured. "This isn't their first encounter with whatever this phenomenon is." The Norwegian team worked methodically for nearly an hour, setting up equipment around the perimeter of the transformed ice. Then, at some signal not visible through the drones' cameras, they stepped back in unison. The devices activated simultaneously, creating a visible energy field that enveloped the transparent circle. For several tense minutes, nothing appeared to happen. Then slowly, the ice began to change again, not returning to its natural state, but rather developing a milky opacity that obscured what lay beneath. "They're not studying it," Chen realized. "They're containing it." Before they could observe further, the drone's transmission suddenly cut out. No warning, no degradation of signal, just an immediate and complete loss of connection. Hoffman worked frantically to re-establish contact, but it was clear the drone had been either disabled or destroyed. "We've seen enough," Jensen decided. "We need to get this data back to the facility and analyze it before deciding our next move." The return journey was conducted in tense silence, each researcher processing what they had witnessed and its implications. It wasn't until they were safely back inside the hidden complex that Jensen finally articulated what they were all thinking. The Norwegian government, or some division within it, has been aware of whatever is beneath that glacier for a very long time. What we've been treating as a new discovery is something they've been monitoring and containing for decades, possibly centuries. Which raises the question, Chen added, of why they allowed the initial exploration of U-731 to proceed at all. If they knew what was down there, why risk exposing it? The answer came 3 days later, in the form of an unexpected visitor. Jensen was reviewing thermal imaging data in the archive when the facility's proximity alarm activated, indicating someone had approached within 50 meters of the hidden entrance. Security protocols automatically locked down all systems and initiated emergency preparation measures. But before the team could decide how to respond, the facility's communication system crackled to life. "Dr. Jensen," said a calm, accented voice that she immediately recognized as Norwegian. "My name is Dr. Lars Vollen. I believe we have mutual research interests concerning what lies beneath Dødens Hånd. I've come alone, and I'm unarmed. I think it's time we had an honest conversation about U-731 and what it found." After a tense debate and thorough security screening, Vollen was brought into the facility. He appeared to be in his 60s, with a weathered face that spoke of decades spent in harsh conditions and eyes that carried the weight of knowledge Jensen immediately recognized. The look of someone who had seen things that had fundamentally altered their understanding of reality. "You've gone to extraordinary lengths to continue your research, despite official restrictions," Vollen observed once they were seated in the facility's small conference room. "That shows commitment, or perhaps obsession. Both can be valuable in the right circumstances." "Who exactly are you?" Jensen demanded, unwilling to play diplomatic games. Vollen smiled thinly. "Officially, I'm a scientific advisor to the Norwegian Polar Institute. Unofficially, I serve as the current archivist for what we call the Isforsvar, the ice defense. We are an organization that predates the modern Norwegian state, with origins stretching back to the early medieval period. Our purpose has remained constant, to monitor and contain what lies beneath the Svalbard ice." He reached into his coat and, after a nod of permission from Lavik, withdrew a small leather case. From it, he removed a photograph, ancient by the look of its sepia tones and fading edges, showing a group of men in early 20th century Arctic expedition gear standing beside what appeared to be an excavation site in a glacier. This was taken in 1899 during what was publicly described as a geographical survey of Svalbard. In reality, it was the third attempted excavation of the chamber that now lies beneath U-731. He tapped one figure in the image, a young man with intense eyes who stood slightly apart from the others. My great-grandfather, Henrik Vollen. Of the 12 men who entered the chamber during that expedition, he was one of only 3 who emerged. The others. He paused. The others walked back into the depths voluntarily, despite attempts to restrain them. Jensen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic temperatures outside. Just like the Norse expedition, just like U-731's crew. Vollen nodded solemnly. The pattern has repeated throughout history. We've documented at least 18 separate incidents of human contact with what we call the influence since the first recorded encounter in 873 CE. Each follows the same progression: discovery, fascination, hearing voices, compulsion to return to the source, and ultimately, dissolution. Dissolution? Chen asked, her scientific precision requiring clarity. Those who return to the chamber and remain there for more than a few hours begin to change physiologically, Vollen explained, his clinical tone barely masking the horror of what he described. Cellular breakdown at the molecular level. It's as if they're being repurposed. Jensen recalled the strange crystalline formations in the Viking wood fragments and the similar patterns found on U-731's hull. Repurposed for what? Vollen spread his hands in a gesture of uncertainty. That remains unclear, even after centuries of study. The Isforsvar has theories, ranging from the biological to the metaphysical, but no definitive answers. What we do know is that the chamber is not a natural formation. It appears to be a constructed space created by intelligences not human, preserved within the ice for purposes we can only speculate about. Why are you telling us this now? Hoffman demanded. If this has been a closely guarded secret for centuries, why reveal it to us? Because something has changed, Vollen admitted, his composure finally cracking to reveal genuine concern. For all recorded history, the influence has been passive, dormant, you might say. It affects only those who directly encounter it. But since the discovery of U-731, it has become active. The frequency and intensity of electromagnetic emissions from the chamber have increased exponentially. The ice reorganization you witnessed 3 days ago is unprecedented in our records. And most concerning of all, we've begun detecting what appear to be attempts at communication. Communication? Jensen leaned forward. With whom? That's what we need to determine. Vollen fixed her with an intense gaze. The Norwegian government officially denies the existence of the Isforsvar, just as they deny the true nature of what lies beneath Dødens Hånd. But unofficially, they provide us with resources and authorization to take whatever measures are necessary to contain the influence. Those measures have been sufficient for centuries, until now. He placed another item on the table, a small cylindrical device that resembled a thumb drive, but was clearly constructed of more advanced materials. This contains all of the Isforsvar's historical records concerning the chamber, including detailed analysis of the artifacts recovered in 1899, 1944, and 2023. I'm authorized to offer you a proposal. Collaborate with us in understanding what has changed and why the influence has suddenly become active. In return, you gain access to knowledge accumulated over a millennium. Jensen exchanged glances with Chen and Hoffman, reading the same mixture of wariness and academic curiosity in their expressions that she felt herself. And if we refuse? Vollen didn't bother with threats or ultimatums. then we continue working separately toward the same goal. But I believe your expertise in maritime history and Dr. Chen's archaeological knowledge, combined with the Isforsvar's historical records, provide the best chance of understanding what we're facing before it progresses further. You're afraid, Jensen realized. After all this time containing it, you're genuinely afraid of what's happening now. Volin didn't deny it. The influence has always been content to wait. It has existed within the ice for thousands of years, occasionally encountering humans, occasionally claiming them, but never actively seeking contact. Now it's reaching out, creating pathways, marking its location. These are not the actions of something dormant or patient. He met her gaze directly. These are the actions of something preparing. Preparing for what? Chen asked the question they were all thinking. To leave, Volin replied simply. The ice is melting, Dr. Jensen. Climate change is altering the Arctic more rapidly than at any point in human history. The patterns we've observed suggest the influence is responding to these changes, adapting, preparing for a world where its icy barrier no longer exists. The implications were staggering. Whatever had claimed the crews of Viking ships, claimed the men of U-731, and had been contained within Svalbard's ice for millennia, was apparently awakening to a rapidly changing world, one where the natural prison that had held it was literally melting away. What exactly are you proposing? Jensen asked after a long moment of consideration. A joint expedition, Volin replied without hesitation. Not to the transformed section, that's too dangerous at present, but to a secondary entrance to the chamber system that the Isforsvar has monitored since 1753. It hasn't been accessed in decades, but our readings suggest it remains viable. We would enter under strict containment protocols, with the primary goal of placing new monitoring equipment that might help us understand the changes in the influence's behavior. Jensen considered the proposal carefully. Every scientific instinct urged her to accept the opportunity to access centuries of accumulated knowledge about one of the world's most profound mysteries was unprecedented. But experience had taught her to look for the unspoken catches in too-good-to-be-true offers. And the secondary goal? She asked, knowing there must be more. Volin's expression remained carefully neutral. To determine if U-731's discovery and the artifacts it removed have somehow catalyzed the influence's awakening, and if so, to determine how to reverse the process before it completes whatever preparation it has begun. It was Chen who voiced the question that needed to be asked. And if it can't be reversed? For the first time, Volin's composure faltered completely. A look of grim resignation crossed his features before he answered. Then the Isforsvar will implement final containment protocols. Döden's Hond will be destroyed, along with everything beneath it. That's impossible, Hoffman objected. The glacier is massive. We have methods, Volin cut him off, developed over centuries and refined with modern technology. I pray they won't be necessary, but if the influence cannot be contained. He left the sentence unfinished. But his meaning was clear. Jensen made her decision. We'll need time to review your data before agreeing to anything. And we'll need guarantees of our safety and academic freedom to publish what we learn. The legitimate scientific discoveries, at least, Volin nodded, seemingly relieved by her conditional acceptance. The Isforsvar can provide those guarantees. Review the data. I'll return in 3 days for your answer. He rose to leave, then paused. One final piece of information you should consider in your decision. 3 days ago, immediately following the ice transformation event, monitoring stations across Svalbard detected a transmission originating from the chamber. Not electromagnetic, not sonic, something else entirely that our instruments barely registered. But it was powerful enough to reach orbit. Orbit? Jensen repeated, not understanding. Whatever the influence is, Dr. Jensen, it sent something outward. A signal, a message, a call. Vollen's eyes reflected a fear older than himself, past, down through generations of watchers, and we have no idea what might answer. As Vollen departed under Lavik's escort, Jensen, Chen, and Hoffman gathered around the mysterious storage device he had left behind. It represented a historical archive spanning centuries, potentially containing answers to questions they had only begun to formulate. But it also represented a decision point, a threshold beyond which there would be no returning to the comfortable academic world of theories and peer review. If what he's saying is true, Hoffman said quietly, then what's beneath that glacier isn't just an archaeological mystery, it's an active threat. Chen nodded slowly. A threat that's been contained for thousands of years by the very ice that's now melting away. It's almost poetic in its terrible symmetry, humanity's impact on the climate potentially releasing something humanity has never had to face. Jensen picked up the device, feeling its weight, both physical and metaphorical. We need to know what we're dealing with before we decide anything. Let's see what the Isfos Va has been hiding all these centuries. As they connected the device to an isolated system and began accessing its contents, none of them noticed the faint crystalline structures that had begun to form on the runic tablet in its sealed case. Molecular patterns reorganizing themselves, in perfect synchronicity with something calling from deep beneath the ice. The helicopter blades sliced through the Arctic air as Sarah Jensen gazed down at the expanding research camp below. What had begun as a small scientific outpost 3 months ago had evolved into a sprawling international operation. Researchers from 12 countries now worked in rotating shifts. Government agencies had established a perimeter extending 5 kilometers in all directions, and military vessels patrolled the surrounding waters. The world might not know what lay beneath Duden's Hond, but those in power clearly understood the significance of what they were dealing with. "We'll be landing in 2 minutes," the pilot announced over the intercom. "Weather conditions are deteriorating, storm system moving in from the northeast." Jensen nodded, though she knew the approaching storm was only partly natural. The weather patterns around the glacier had grown increasingly erratic since they'd opened the chamber 3 weeks ago. Electromagnetic disturbances interfered with communications, temperature fluctuations defied meteorological models, and the aurora borealis displayed configurations that senior researchers described as impossible. Nature itself seemed to be responding to what they had awakened. Dr. Chen was waiting when the helicopter touched down, her face partially obscured by her thermal hood, but her tension evident in her rigid posture. "It's changing again," she said. Without preamble, as Jensen disembarked, "We need you in the analysis center immediately." They traversed the camp in silence, passing research stations where teams of scientists pored over data, military checkpoints where armed personnel verified their credentials, and medical facilities where staff monitored everyone for signs of the transformation that had claimed so many before them. The operation's scale reflected its urgency. What had begun as archaeological curiosity had rapidly evolved into what some officials were privately calling an existential threat assessment. The analysis center occupied what had once been U-731 itself. After the submarine had been fully excavated and its remaining artifacts catalogued, the Military Engineering Corps had repurposed its reinforced hull as a command center, using its natural Faraday cage-like properties to protect sensitive equipment from the increasingly powerful electromagnetic pulses emanating from below. Dr. Marcus Hoffman and Dr. Lars Vollen were waiting inside, along with a woman Jensen didn't recognize, tall, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. The screens surrounding them displayed real-time data from the chamber beneath, including thermal imaging, molecular analysis, and what they now called consciousness. Mapping, the monitoring of the strange patterns of energy that appeared to carry information or awareness throughout the transformed material. Dr. Jensen, Vollen greeted her with the grim formality that had characterized all their interactions since the chamber had been fully opened. Thank you for returning so quickly. This is Director Elise Sorensen of the United Nations Special Committee on Non-Conventional Threats. Jensen nodded to the woman, understanding that her presence represented a significant escalation in how governments were classifying the situation. What's changed? Hoffman gestured to the central display, where a three-dimensional model of the chamber and its surrounding ice rotated slowly. The reconfiguration has accelerated exponentially in the past 12 hours. The molecular restructuring is now extending through the ice at approximately 3 meters per hour in all directions. At this rate, it will reach the ocean in approximately 6 days. And we've confirmed it's not random, Chen added, manipulating the display to zoom in on specific sections. The restructuring follows precise patterns that repeat at different scales, fractals that carry both structural information and what appears to be encoded data. It's building something. Not building, Vollen corrected quietly. Rebuilding. The Isfosvar archives were incomplete. There's evidence now that what lies beneath the ice isn't just a visitor or an anomaly. It was here before humans, before the ice, perhaps before recorded time itself. Director Sorensen spoke for the first time, her accent faintly Scandinavian, but her English perfect. Dr. Jensen, I've reviewed your work on the runic tablet and Captain Hart's journal. You proposed a theory about what this entity actually is. The committee needs to hear it directly from you. Jensen took a deep breath. What had begun as a speculative hypothesis 3 weeks ago had gained credibility with each new piece of data they recovered. It remained beyond conventional scientific understanding, but it was the only explanation that accounted for all observed phenomena. I believe we're dealing with a distributed consciousness, she began, choosing her words carefully. Not extraterrestrial in the conventional sense, but fundamentally non-human in its organization and perception. The evidence suggests it once existed across much of the Arctic region as an interconnected network, using what we would now identify as advanced biotechnology to extend itself through various mediums: water, stone, organic material. She brought up her own data on one of the secondary screens, translations of the runic tablet compared with similar warnings found in Sami oral traditions, Inuit carvings, and more recent accounts, including U-731's logs. Approximately 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last major glaciation period, something happened. Possibly a natural event. Possibly deliberate intervention by early humans who encountered it. The entity was largely destroyed, with only a small portion surviving beneath what would become Svalbard. The ice formed a natural containment, keeping it isolated but not killing it. It's been there ever since, occasionally encountering humans who ventured too close, sometimes absorbing them into its network, but largely dormant. Until now, Sorensen concluded, until climate change began melting its prison, and we provided the final key by excavating the submarine. Yes, Jensen confirmed. U-731 was sent to investigate reports of unusual phenomena in this region, part of the Nazi obsession with obtaining power beyond conventional understanding. They found the chamber, removed artifacts that had been part of the entity's network for millennia, and inadvertently triggered its reactivation. The crew was absorbed, becoming part of its consciousness, but the submarine itself remained trapped in the ice, a physical connection to the world above that the entity couldn't utilize. Until we found it. and provided the final components it needed, Chen added somberly. The artifacts we removed from the containment chamber, they weren't just objects, they were nodes in its network. By bringing them to the surface, studying them, connecting them to our equipment, we essentially gave it access to our technology, our knowledge, our methods, which it's now incorporating into its reconstruction, Hoffman concluded, pointing to sections of the model where the restructuring showed clear evidence of modern technological principles merged with the entity's own unfathomable designs. The question, Sorensen said, is whether this entity represents a threat that requires the implementation of final containment protocols. The Security Council is divided. Some members believe we should continue observation, potentially establishing communication if possible. Others advocate for immediate neutralization, regardless of the scientific knowledge that might be lost. Jensen had been dreading this moment. As a scientist, the entity beneath Döden's Hond represented the discovery of a lifetime, a form of intelligence and technology beyond human understanding, potentially offering insights that could transform their knowledge of consciousness itself. But as someone who had read the historical accounts, translated the warnings, and seen firsthand what happened to those who were absorbed, she also recognized the potential danger it posed. There's a third option, she said finally, one that neither destroys it completely nor risks letting it expand unchecked. She pulled up the complete mapping they had done of the chamber system, highlighting specific nodes that their analysis had identified as critical junction points in the entity's network. These 7 locations appear to function as primary connection hubs, similar to servers in a distributed computing system. If we could place specially designed inhibitor devices at each location, we might be able to establish a stable containment field, not destroying the entity, but limiting its ability to extend beyond defined boundaries. You're suggesting we negotiate boundaries with it? Sorensen asked, sounding skeptical. Not negotiate, Jensen clarified. Establish. The historical records consistently show that the entity respects certain types of barriers, the runic wards, the Norse created, the containment fields the Isforsvar developed. It's not aggression that drives it, but expansion. The fundamental imperative to reconnect the network it lost millennia ago. If we can convince it that expansion into human domains isn't possible, it might adapt to exist within the boundaries we establish. Vollan studied the proposed locations with a thoughtful expression. It could work. The Isforsvar has centuries of data on containment methodologies. With modern technology and power sources, we could potentially create a sustainable solution. And if it doesn't work, Sorensen pressed, if the entity breaches your containment, then the final protocols remain an option, Jensen conceded. But destroying something we barely understand should be our last resort, not our first response. The debate continued for hours, with experts from various fields weighing in via secure communications, military officials assessing strategic implications, and scientists arguing for the preservation of knowledge. Through it all, Jensen found herself returning to the fundamental question that had haunted her since they first discovered U-731. What was the entity beneath the ice actually trying to accomplish? The answer came 3 days later, as she stood with Chen and Hoffman in what they now called the interface, a specially constructed chamber at the edge of the transformed zone, where the entity's molecular restructuring met the natural ice. Here they could observe the processes directly while remaining behind protective barriers. Look at this, Chen said, pointing to new patterns forming in the transformed material. It's creating something different here. Not expansion, but a defined structure with clear boundaries. Jensen studied the formation, noting how the flowing patterns were converging to create what appeared to be a discrete object approximately 1 meter in diameter. Unlike the continuous restructuring they had observed elsewhere, this formation had a distinct beginning and end, a deliberate creation rather than an ongoing process. It's responding to our presence, she realized, to our observation. It's creating something specifically for us to find. As they watched, the object gradually took shape. A sphere composed of intricately patterned material that resembled both organic tissue and advanced technology. Within it, energies pulsed in complex sequences, reminiscent of the consciousness mapping patterns they had observed throughout the entity's network. "It's a communication node," Hoffman suggested, checking readings from their sensors. "The patterns match what we've identified as information transfer within the larger network, but concentrated and organized in a way we haven't seen before." When the object was complete, it detached itself from the surrounding material, hovering slightly above the surface, as if waiting. The implications were clear. This was an invitation, or perhaps a test. "It wants to communicate directly," Jensen said. "It's created an interface specifically designed for human interaction." The risks were obvious. Everyone who had previously attempted direct communication with the entity had been absorbed into its consciousness. Yet the opportunity to establish genuine understanding was equally compelling. After an emergency meeting involving the highest levels of international authority, a decision was reached. They would attempt communication using a remote neural interface, technology originally developed for medical applications that could transmit human neural patterns without physical contact. Jensen volunteered immediately. "I've studied this entity more extensively than anyone else alive. If anyone has a chance of interpreting its communication correctly, it's me." Despite objections, particularly from Vollen, who had witnessed too many losses to the entity's influence, the operation was approved. 3 days later, Jensen sat in a specially constructed chamber, a safe distance from the interface, connected to equipment that would translate her neural patterns into signals. The communication node could potentially interpret, while simultaneously protecting her from direct neural intrusion. "Remember the protocols," Chen reminded her as technicians made final adjustments to the equipment. "At the first sign of consciousness bleed-through, we terminate the connection, no exceptions." Jensen nodded, though they both knew the line between communication and influence might be difficult to determine when dealing with a fundamentally non-human consciousness. As the system activated, she closed her eyes, focusing on the conceptual framework they had developed, simple mathematical principles that they hoped would establish a foundation for more complex exchange. The initial connection felt like stepping into an ocean of awareness, vast, fluid, encompassing. Jensen's trained mind maintained focus on the mathematical constructs, projecting them into this sea of consciousness like a lighthouse beam cutting through fog. For several minutes, there was no response beyond a swirling acknowledgement of her presence. Then suddenly, clarity, not in words or images, but in direct conceptual transfer. The entity was communicating, not through language, but through pure information exchange at a neural level. Jensen felt her understanding expanding as her mind was presented with perspectives and perceptions beyond human experience, sensing through ice and stone, processing information across distributed networks, perceiving time in patterns rather than linear progression. Through this expanded awareness, Jensen began to grasp what the entity beneath Dödens truly was. Not a singular being, but a vast ecological network that had once spanned much of the Arctic region, evolving over millions of years into a distributed intelligence that existed in harmony with its environment. What humans had interpreted as aggression or threat was simply its fundamental nature, the imperative to connect, to expand, to incorporate new elements into its network. Most surprisingly, Jensen realized the entity harbored no hostility toward humanity. It perceived the absorption of human consciousness not as destruction, but as preservation, incorporating their experiences, memories, and awareness into its eternal network. In its perception, it was offering transcendence, not death. But with this understanding came a crucial insight. The entity's expansion was fundamentally incompatible with human civilization. Its very nature, the molecular restructuring that allowed it to extend its network, would transform environments in ways that would render them uninhabitable for conventional life. Not from malice, but from the simple reality that its existence operated on principles that would inevitably displace other forms of life. This realization flowed both ways. As Jensen comprehended the entity's nature, it began to understand humanity's perspective, the fear of absorption, the desire for continued individual existence, the need for environments that remained stable rather than transformed. A conceptual exchange took place that transcended language, reaching mutual understanding that neither had possessed before. When Jensen finally emerged from the communication trance, hours had passed, though it had felt like both moments and eternity. She found herself surrounded by concerned colleagues, medical personnel monitoring her vital signs, and security officers ready to intervene if she showed any signs of transformation. "It worked," she said simply, her voice hoarse from disuse. "We understand each other now." The agreement that followed was unprecedented in human history, a negotiated boundary between fundamentally different forms of intelligent life. The entity would be allowed to reclaim a portion of the Arctic that was already becoming ice-free due to climate change, establishing a transformation zone where its network could expand within strictly defined parameters. In return, it would cease all attempts to extend beyond these boundaries, respecting the division between its domain and human habitation. The implementation required technological innovation beyond anything previously developed, a combination of physical barriers, electromagnetic fields, and monitoring systems designed to contain an entity that existed primarily as information. Embedded in matter, the Isforsvar's centuries of experience proved invaluable, their ancient knowledge of containment merging with cutting-edge science to create a solution neither could have achieved alone. 6 months later, Jensen stood at the edge of the newly established boundary, watching as the transformation zone thrived with activity. Beyond the containment field, the entity's domain pulsed with life and awareness, its surface shimmering, with patterns that human eyes could barely comprehend, but that sensors identified as complex information exchange. It was neither beautiful nor ugly by human standards, simply alien, a form of existence that operated on principles beyond conventional understanding. "Do you think it will honor the agreement?" Chen asked, joining her at the observation point. "Permanently?" Jensen considered the question carefully. The communication she had shared with the entity had been profound, revealing aspects of its nature that centuries of observation had never uncovered. But it remained fundamentally non-human, its perceptions and priorities alien despite their newfound understanding. "I think it understands the consequences of breaking containment," she replied finally. "Not just the threat of destruction, but the recognition that our forms of existence require different environments to thrive. Coexistence requires separation, at least until both sides evolve to a point where greater integration might become possible." She didn't share the deeper insight she had gained during that communication, the understanding that the entity beneath Durden's Hond was ancient beyond human reckoning, patient in ways that made centuries seem like moments. It would honor the agreement, not just from self-preservation, but from genuine curiosity about what humanity might become, given time to develop on its own evolutionary path. The permanent research station established at the boundary would continue, monitoring for generations, maintaining the containment technology, and studying the entity from a safe distance. Knowledge would accumulate, understanding would deepen, and perhaps someday a new form of communication would emerge that bridged the gap between such fundamentally different forms of intelligence. But for now, the mystery of U-731 had been solved, though not in any way its crew could have imagined when they sailed into these waters 80 years ago. The submarine remained preserved in a special facility, a monument to the sailors whose disappearance had ultimately led to one of humanity's most profound discoveries: the knowledge that intelligence could evolve in forms utterly unlike their own, creating beings that were neither gods nor monsters, but simply different. As Jensen turned to leave, she caught a final glimpse of the transformation zone, a shimmer of patterns that seemed, just for a moment, to arrange themselves into a form reminiscent of human faces. Not a threat or a call, but an acknowledgement. Consciousness recognizing consciousness across an unbridgeable divide, separated by necessity, but connected by understanding. The Arctic would keep its secrets now, by mutual agreement, the ice continuing its ancient role as barrier between worlds. What lay beneath would remain there, contained not by ignorance, but by wisdom, preserved not by fear, but by respect for differences that defined the very nature of existence itself. The mystery had become a boundary, a line drawn not by conflict, but by understanding, marking where one form of life ended and another began. In a universe vast enough to contain such profound differences, perhaps that was the greatest discovery of all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.